Hello, everyone. This is Lala, and today I'm going to be covering the second season of The Real World, which is The Real World Los Angeles. So, just a few things that I want to mention. So they expanded the season, so they filmed it for like 6 months, and I do think that was a pretty bad choice, especially because you could see how tired the housemates got at the time, and I think this caused them to be a lot more isolated and a lot of them doing more of their own thing because they were there for such long periods of time. And we got a lot more episodes, and that honestly just kind of annoyed me too. So I think that was the huge flaw of this season, in my opinion. But overall, I do like the season. They also did the same thing where they filmed it and then they aired it right after they filmed it. So pretty much the same thing they did in the first season, and this was filmed and aired in 1993. So I guess at this point in the real world history, they did it every once a year. So some of these people I did know about. Um, I knew about Tammy due to her run on Basketball Wives and the craziness she got into there. So it's interesting to hear her origin story. Obviously, I know a lot about Beth due to her extensive career on The Challenge, even up until recently. And John, I kind of knew about from his brief run on The Challenge, which was a while ago at this point, but I didn't know much about him personally until watching this. I don't think the cast is as strong as the first season. Obviously, you have to get two replacements, and I don't think the replacements were the strongest people, and even some of the originals didn't get a whole lot to do. I did find it interesting that they cast someone who was about to get married, and then another person who was still in school, so I think that played a part into a lot of things as well. And I did hear that this was another cast that got a homecoming, so I did some research when it comes to what happened there. And based on what happened on this season, I'm not surprised that Homecoming was just as crazy for the cast members that showed up. And oh yes, I did recognize David from the one episode of the challenge that he did where he was just as wild out as he was here. So the season starts with the season one cast reuniting in their apartments a year later, where they talked about all the updates with them and all that jazz, and they talk about predictions for this season. And honestly, I'm not going to cover it since it lasts like an episode and a half. So I'm just going to get right to the cast of this season. So the first person from season two that we meet is Dominic, who is kind of like a punk rocker like figure, and he had to pick up one one of the two other roommates that he doesn't know, but the first one that he picks up is Tammy. So they're told that the season is 6 months long, so 2 months longer than last season. Dominic is a writer for newspaper columns and a rocker, and Tammy is an R&B singer, as she's currently in a girl group that she compares to In Vogue. Very high standards there, just by that comparison. They drive to Kentucky to pick up John, who is a country cowboy singer, and he is very sheltered. They are then driving to Tennessee, then they stay there for the night, then they drive somewhere the next morning. There are some talks about sex, which John finds to be very uncomfortable. John then talks about how Tammy and Dominic are strange since he nor anyone else he lives with or near is like either of them, and he doesn't see or deal with people like them, which the other two kind of feel offended by the statement. And then John mentions how, like, they don't know, or anyone who doesn't believe in the basic principles of Christianity is lost. So it starts things on a very awkward note. So it seems like they are traveling around to pick up everyone before arriving to the location in Los Angeles, or that's what I was predicting, but I ended up being wrong on this since it only ended up being those three. Um, Dominic and John are talking about Christianity, where Dominic isn't a huge believer of it, and of course John is grilling him about what part of the Bible he believes in, and all of this just really just puts John on my shit list right at the beginning, because why are you so judgmental? Anyways, Tammy mentions that she is a Muslim and her last name, Akbar, kind of gives it away. But it somehow then leads to Tammy calling John a bigot because he criticized Islam and he thinks that she is mad because, according to her stereotypes, he's supposed to hate her as a black woman. And then they somehow argue about black movies and white movies. They arrive to Las Vegas, and then we have John and Tammy yet again arguing. Since she calls his town a hick town, and he says that they don't allow trash like her to get into their town. They then threaten to hit one another, and this started because she mentioned how he has only a few friends in his little town, and how that doesn't mean shit when it comes to everywhere else. Tammy is breaking down in her confessionals about John's blatant microaggression and asks to not be filmed. So things are a great start here. They finally arrive in Hollywood where their house is at. They meet their roommates, Aaron, David, and it seems like David and Tammy are getting close immediately, which is ironic. Beth, though Dominic's annoyed with the cat that she brought in, and Irene, who her fiance dropped off and she wanted him to meet the roommates. And it's crazy that they hired someone who's getting married while the season is filming. They actually set up a standard confessional room, or at least that's what I thought, which isn't really consistent after watching this, or as I was watching the season, and everyone is setting up their rooms. David is a comedian, Beth is essentially a actor, Irene is a deputy marshal, and Aaron is a student at UCLA. They end the episode going on a tour around town and getting to know one another, where Tammy, John, and Dominic agree to leave everything that happened on the bus on the bus. I still don't know why they had only three of them travel on the bus for over a week while the other four just immediately went to the house. I don't know why they made that choice. Irene gets up at 5 a.m. to go to work as a police officer, and Tammy's had a suspended license for 5 months since she has two warrants for unpaid parking tickets, apparently. David and John are talking about rap music, where John only listens to Christian rap, and David talks about how John is stereotyping rappers with claiming that they only curse. They talked about the first episode last season where Julie made that microaggressive comment about Heather's beeper, as David also has the beeper. It comes off more like a joke here, but David mentions that John is an 18-year-old who thinks he knows it all. You can just tell that John is not just getting it, though. We see more of David and John arguing about their music, where David doesn't mind John's country music, but John is just annoyed with David's jazz and hip hop music. What's wrong with jazz? Anyways. We move on to Dominic's dog and Beth's cat fighting one another, so I guess that comment in the last episode about Beth's cat was foreshadowing, and neither of them want to abandon their pet or to really send them away. We then see Dominic and Beth arguing about their pets, though it's really just the pot calling the kettle black, in my opinion. Beth has a friend who's hosting a party, and she wants some of the roommates to go to the party, which then leads to a discussion of John not buying his future wife tampons. What the F? Pretty much, the friend didn't know all of these people were showing up, and Beth wasn't even invited her damn self to the party, much less they were, so they were all kicked out. Once he gets back to the house, John is trying to prevent Beth from going downstairs, as Dominic's kind of just talking crap about the situation, and he does call her out, and essentially he says that he wants to rip her apart for humiliating them by her inviting 6 people to go to the party where even she wasn't invited. David mentions that people thought he stole something at the party, and this leads to him and John arguing yet again about the same stuff that they've been arguing about throughout the entire episode. After David wore a Malcolm X shirt, John wanted to hang up a Confederate flag to provoke him. Lovely. The cast wonders why David irons his clothes because he didn't have a whole lot of clothes going up, and it leads to a long backstory that's pretty interesting in my opinion. Anyways, it seems like Irene and John have a good relationship, and we learn that she is getting married here. I kind of mentioned that earlier, so I kind of brought up points earlier than I should have. Anyways, Irene is really missing her fiance, but her mom told her that the experience will make her marrying her fiance a lot more special. Anyways, the episode is ending with Beth and Dominic getting along, and David singing and talking about masturbation to intentionally bother John. It seems like the two were starting to get along, and then it ends up with David about to beat John's ass because John did not clean his styrofoam nuts all over the floor, and Aaron essentially had to break it up. The episode starts off with how attractive Tammy and David think of one another, especially on David's side. Tammy is focused on her girl group where they're in the studio recording. I do see Tammy rapping, and she honestly isn't bad. Beth tells David that he and Tammy are definitely going to hook up within the time span of 2 weeks, and this ends up in a conversation with David and Beth talking about masturbation, where he says that everyone masturbates, and she states that she never has. So this is the second episode in a row where he's brought up masturbation, and the other person's uncomfortable. David, John, Tammy, and a few of David's friends went to a tattoo shop, and they all went to the Spike Lee store to get John some clothes, but he really just wasn't for it. David and Tammy were going to go out for dinner, but she ended up bailing because that day wasn't about the three of them, where it's just his friends just kind of tagging along, and she didn't like that. David tells his friends, and she does end up apologizing to him. Some of the cast end up going to dinner, but Beth and Tammy are talking about stuffing their boobs and butts in front of John, and it's just awkward. And Tammy talks about being on a talk show called Studs, which was a dating show essentially where two guys date off of the three women, and we do see this on the show, with her being one of the guests. David feels a way about Tammy going on these dates, and it's clear because he likes her but isn't handling it the best. The house ends up going boning, and David snaps because they left without him, and he's tired of the cliques. So he's yelling at Irene and Dominic, causing her to drive off, and Dominic and David continue arguing once they're outside once again. But Dominic claims that David was on the phone while they were leaving the house, or before they were leaving the house, so they just left. There ends up being a house meeting where they are complaining about the cleaning. David snaps at people, and apparently Beth was on the phone when it was for David, and she told them to call back, so he doesn't appreciate that. And this ends up being a David versus everyone situation at this point. We have more content of Tammy on the dating talk show, and she ended up losing the competition, where things with the guy is over, essentially. We get content on Aaron, who is very into his studies, but he and Dominic got very close together from the beginning, though some people in the cast think the two have a little crush on one another. They then talk about whether they agree on Social Security, which Dominic does believe in, but Aaron is a Republican who doesn't like that idea. There's not a whole lot happening here, but we see the two of them hanging out on their own, and people do feel a weight of the two of them isolating themselves, which will be a thing throughout the rest of the season. Beth wants to play a softball game, which is kind of odd, but she does end up bringing a friend over. We then have everyone talk about how overdramatic Beth is, and it's amazing how little things change with her over the next 3 decades, or the last 3 decades, however you want to frame it. And then we learn that Beth's cat injured itself from falling between the floors. The house talks about how different and odd John is, and how he refuses to adjust his ways, and it's really to just enjoy California and take advantage of the situation for what it is. Aaron's kind of jabbing at John, and Irene doesn't like it pretty much since Irene's close with John. Anyways, John, Irene, and a fiance end up playing ball with one another, and the duo end up messing with John's drink. John talks about not wanting to get a job because he will make it as a country singer. It's essentially a very boring episode, but it's clear that this episode was the calm before the storm. Feelings are a bit tense in the house at this point, where the initial jokes became more serious and tense. Everyone knows that Irene is leaving the house at some point, so it's clear that once she got there, once they started production, she told them she was only going to be here for a certain amount of time. And someone is moving in when that happens. So the four guys at this moment want to mess with the woman's room. They mess with the room, and Tammy's the first one who sees it, and she tells the men off, and they make fun of her hand and head movement. Of course they do. David decides to go in the room to speak to Tammy, but she is not really fully naked, but she only has like her on, underwear and a bra on. And she goes to cover herself up. David and John try to pull the covers off of her, and they do give Beth props for trying to help Tammy. But Tammy ends up leaving the room. David runs after her and drags her in the sheet. Pretty much, she didn't want them to see her in her underwear. The situation is just very, very, very awkward. She's laughing, but you can tell that she's very, very, very nervous, and it's not like I'm enjoying this life. And she tells them stop over and over and over and over and over again. And clearly, the message just wasn't listened to. She goes in the washroom and gets a robe where is very mad at this point. Tammy ends up pouring David's mouthwash on his bed, where And when she finds him, she does go after him. He sees what happened on his bed, so the two of them are kind of getting rough with one another, and it's very awkward. I knew about the situation, but I didn't actually see it or know like how it went play by play by play by play. So this was definitely a lot to watch. David thinks Beth is instigating the situation where the two women are yelling at David. He pretty much flashes them off, and she tells them, or she says that she told him to stop several times, and that is true. Tammy calls out the other guys for not doing anything, and of course they defend themselves, and more yelling is happening, and these entire situation is a complete mess. David and Beth are then yelling at one another, and she mentions that he is saying something that rapists, sorry, grapists say to defend themselves. And of course, he's very, very, very offended by this because he isn't a rapist, and he mentions that Tammy, as well as Beth, was laughing at the situation. And stuff like this is just a huge miscommunication, and it leads to a huge snowball effect, which is why he feels like he wasn't doing anything wrong. So, pretty much, Tammy packs up her stuff and leaves for the night, and David does the same thing too, but this was, or from his end, it was due to Beth's comments. And Beth is heavily pushing that David needs to be punished. The next morning, David realizes that he didn't know what he did wrong, and Tammy does end up coming back, meaning that they thought at the point that she wasn't going to come back. Apparently, she had an eating disorder around this time, and she was also raped and kidnapped a few months beforehand. They didn't mention this in the episode, this is from research, so it explains why she acted the way she acted. So pretty much everyone but David met out to talk about the situation. People took responsibility for their part in it, and all of David's confrontations that happened in the house throughout the season up until this point was brought up, where Irene mentions that this wasn't the first time, and she feels intimidated by him. David wants to speak to Tammy and Beth on their own, and they both refuse to do so, which only pisses him off even more. And it seems like there was a conversation or confrontation that started at this episode, but they didn't air it, so it's a weird continuity there. Irene doesn't want to talk to him on his own either, but David wants to talk to them without the cameras, as he does not want to talk in a group situation. And it seems like they told him already that he is leaving, but they didn't, or they either didn't show us that, or they just didn't record it. So it's just very off. He doesn't like being treated like a child, and he gets what he did is wrong. He talks to them in the living room, and Tammy recaps the situation once again, where David mentions that the both of them are laughing, and he brings up how Beth brought Tammy into the room to look at Dominic's underwear, and the cameras do show that. Tammy mentions that when someone says stop, that's when you stop, and that happened several times. David doesn't like being accused of rape, and he is not a pervert. Apparently, one of his guy friends tried making advances towards Irene, but he stopped it. We were never shown this. Tammy doesn't care about the other situations, but she feels unsafe with him in the house, and if he stays, she will leave herself. David mentions that if he has to leave, then Beth has to leave as well, since she did it to Dominic, so the two of them are arguing, and it's honestly kind of just a deflection from him. Of course, Beth wants to walk away, and he's following her around, which is definitely helping his case. The men don't know what they want to do or what they should do to it, since Dominic doesn't want David's career ruined. This will come up a lot in Homecoming from what I've researched. Aaron doesn't want him thrown out, and John is just confused. Apparently, David choked John at a prior event, which we weren't shown that, and everyone is talking around or about the other moments, not around, about. David tries to speak to Beth again, and she refuses to be the scapegoat, where she takes the grape comment back, but he committed sexual battery. Irene says that she is going to call the police if he doesn't leave. David does his final confessional and makes some phone calls so he can leave, where he does make his final goodbyes. Everyone is talking about how they don't want to ruin his life or career, and they are talking specifically about the grape comment. So it was very interesting watching David here after his one episode on the challenge, which was a decade after this season, and it's crazy how little he has changed. I do think that he was very volatile and confrontational, and I don't know if he should have been kicked out, but this was very unforeseen in reality TV, especially at this time, and the layers of race and stuff that came with it. And from what I've heard of Homecoming, the situation comes up yet again, and things only just got worse and worse. So, I'm just gonna say it right now. There's not much to this next episode at all. So the house is now given the task to get a new person as a roommate, and they have to interview a bunch of people to do so. Aaron is trying to come up with a method for all of them to handle the interviews, and you could tell that this was before production just chose whomever they wanted. And it's another example of how the rules of reality TV had not really been set yet. I'm really not going to go through every single person they interviewed since it's just pointless. People are not liking Aaron's approach to it, but we do have them calling the eligible people to tell them whether they are in or not, and they recorded it from the other people's side too. But they end up choosing a man named Glenn, who is an aspiring filmmaker who is in a band and also works in a record store. The episode starts with us getting hints that the drama is just going to continue with Glenn being in the house and David being out. The cast is going camping and they meet their instructor, who's a smaller woman, whom is giving them instructions on how to use the washroom, how they will hike, no fires, alcohol, and a bunch of other stuff. We do see them get to their camping grounds the next day, and after hiking up the large trail, where we see the cast complaining and miserable by the time they get there. They end up getting rained on during the night in their tents, and then they do the rock climbing activity, which a lot of them didn't seem to like or enjoy very much, or at least just from me watching it. Tammy ends up snapping because she's performing the words, and it was around here where it was revealed that she is pregnant, so that's very interesting. Everyone is still talking about their camping weekend, and Tammy apologizes for her behavior, but she does officially announce her pregnancy to the house since it was kind of already done, but she tells them that she's going to terminate it because she's not ready to be a mother yet, and she also knows that a few of the house guests or her roommates do not agree with abortion or about abortion. John, of course, is the biggest example of this and mentions that if people don't have sex before marriage, this wouldn't be an issue. And Beth agrees with Tammy on this. We learn a lot about Tammy and her mother, who had her at 15, and Tammy works at a healthcare center that has a bunch of contraceptives and tools around safe sex. John is arguing with some of the guys about it because they are toe tagging babies, at least that's how they see it, and even if little girls are being raped by their fathers, since the babies matter, the baby should still be born. And Dominic mentions that it's a woman's body and her choice. Somehow this ends up being about politics, though Aaron and John are both Republicans. I think it's just the way that John is going about it that makes him come off as awful and hard to deal with. We do see Aaron at Tammy's work, where he is taking the AIDS awareness course, so he doesn't agree with abortion, but he isn't being a dick about it. He ends up bringing his girlfriend, Erin, to the house, where it ends up with Dominic trying to flirt with her, which is apparently a common thing with the two men. It's just kind of awkward. John and Beth talk about whether oral sex is sex, since Erin is a virgin but engages in oral sex. Somehow, John and Erin's girlfriend end up arguing about Tammy's upcoming abortion, where he believes that the baby should choose. So obviously that can't happen because the fetus is in, yeah. Despite the two having conflicting beliefs, Tammy and John had a few conversations about it, which they didn't air, but he does decide to help her through the process. Tammy's mother talks about how she and Tammy were homeless at one point, where they lived in her Toyota for 3 months, and this happened a few years ago. Sorry, Tammy was talking about her mother and her being homeless. But Tammy's mother is supportive of her getting an abortion. Tammy does go to the clinic where she is going to get to the abortion, and then they're asking her about prior conditions, surgeries, and all that. After the surgery, Tammy feels exhausted, bleeding, and throwing up, where she may be thought that she's being punished for it by God. And apparently, abortions were not legal until a year or so after Tammy was born, where her mother probably would have gotten an abortion if it was legal at the time. Beth is on the phone where a friend of hers found a picture of Aaron not having anything on other than him being behind a surfboard on a calendar. And this will be important for later. We do see Irene leaving the house since she is getting married. They knew that she was leaving from the beginning, but we do have a lot of commentary from the others about her relationship and who wears the pants in the relationship. She tells them how she got engaged and the house decided to buy a wedding present for her, or a wedding present for her. Since arriving in the house, Irene has been planning the wedding and she gave them buttons that remind her of them, I guess as a parting gift. She actually does leave the house now to hug the women, though she mentioned that she would be back. And she does make cameos here and there at certain events throughout the rest of the season. With Irene gone, they had to find another roommate, and Beth finally got the calendar that Aaron did. Apparently, Aaron and Beth have a bad relationship where he teases her, and she and John are just annoyed with it, so they get a bunch of blow up copies of the calendar picture and post it everywhere in the house. And it looks like Dominic might be a part of this as well. The issue is that Aaron is pretending that he's so prude and he would never compromise himself to do all these things, but he ended up doing it. So she's trying to prove her point, and I do actually agree with her on this. And this isn't the only example where Aaron does this. Aaron walks into the house and he didn't get very far until he sees it and laughs about it. I thought he would let it go and take it as a joke, but he does get very, very upset about it. And he starts lashing out about it to the other roommates. Aaron's now saying that he's going to find stuff about all of them to get revenge, and now he's freaking out about, do you know what this would do to my life? It's just ridiculous. Everyone is getting ready for Irene's wedding day, and I realize that this episode is, or I thought this episode was twice as long as usual, but I guess the copy that I had just indicated that. Anyways, they have a nice Catholic wedding, and everyone looks nice. I'm wondering if production helped pay for the wedding, since they did air it, and she was planning the wedding while on the season. Anyways, John looked miserable, and the cast talked about it because um, Irene was a good friend to him who won't be around anymore, and they think he fell in love with her. I don't have a whole lot to say about Irene. I did find her being a cop to be pretty cool, and seeing that bit by bit, but she did have a high horse about herself at times. She didn't get a whole lot of screen time, but her getting married while being cast on the show is interesting, though I doubt that's the show cast someone like that again, since it would disrupt production. What I've heard regarding Homecoming, she's still married to her husband, so good for them. Now they have to find a roommate to take Irene's spot, but the episode starts with a practical joke being done on Dominic, where they tampered with his car, but even Dominic's date knew what was going on. Dominic and John are kind of yelling at one another, and then Dominic essentially shuts down once he's told that it's a joke. The new roommate arrives, and she is Beth A, so we're gonna have to mention their last names, or the first initial of the last names from now on. Where she and John bond over not drinking, and all the other roommates warned her about Tammy, and she understood why when she met Tammy, who's very straightforward and kind of cold. We get segment of Tammy being scared to open up and everyone thinking that she's a bitch. But in reality, she's selfish, those were her words, and is focusing on making herself happy and not making anyone else happy. Beth A speaks to John about how she was an alcoholic and she spoke to God over it, as well as her anger issues, which is why she is now doing labor for movies or whatever, or like she's a production assistant essentially. The Beths talk about love and relationships, where Beth A talks about almost being married, but it didn't work out. Tammy and John asked Beth A about her sexuality because of her shirt, where it mentions a joke about being a lesbian or whatever, and she does admit to being a lesbian, which Tammy feels uneasy about. Okay, so this is interesting because literally, as I was watching this in real time, Tammy had a scandal that blew up where she and her daughter were being interviewed by Candy and Riley from the Real Housewives fame. Tammy's daughter is a lesbian, or she heavily prefers women, and Tammy just really wasn't receptive to it, and she came off horrible in it. So seeing how she reacted to her daughter and how she reacted to Beth 30 years prior, it was very interesting. And it showed how little things change with some people, even if it's been 30 years. Anyways, Beth A handles the questioning very well. Tammy is used to working with gay and lesbian people, but she has never had one in her house, and she is struggling with that. And I do think that's a thing with a decent amount of people, where they either don't interact with or don't really have a problem with gay people or homosexual people, but when they interact with one or it's close to home, it's different. Dominic ends up going home because his father is sick and it's not getting any better, where he feels guilty about enjoying his life, especially being in Hollywood. So it's almost like survivor's remorse, though the person didn't pass away, if that makes sense. John is meeting a music producer, obviously with the expectation of getting signed, but they weren't interested at all. And it seems like they were trying to push him to be a songwriter instead of an artist. But he doesn't write any of his music, and it's also expected for country singers to write. So that's kind of an interesting dichotomy there. Beth A is trying to be helpful and giving him a lot of advice, but he's just not receptive to it or open to listening at all. Dominic gets off the plane to see his family, and his father is notably thinner. We learn that he left his home at 17, and we see him interact more with his family. There's a lot of content with Dominic's family and John wanting to perform at places, but there's not a whole lot to the episode. Irene is in one of the scenes with John, Beth too, so I don't know if this was filmed before Irene left or she's supporting him after leaving. Or, sorry. I didn't. When I saw this, I was questioning that, but we do see her here and there after in random events and stuff, well, into the finale or close to the finale, so I do think this was afterwards. This episode continues from the theme of last episode, where it's a lot more career focused, but this episode's mainly focused on Tammy and Beth S. So Beth S doesn't know what she wants to do, but she wants to be famous, and right now she's trying to be an actress. She takes a headshot so she can send it to casting directors. Tammy is also doing photo shoots with her girl group. Pretty much the casting director Beth S sees ends up shitting on her completely, and Tammy is in the recording studio rapping where the producer is being a bit harsh on her, and he ended up saying that this ain't gonna work, essentially. I believe Tammy brought someone she works with at her center to talk about condoms, safe sex, and the potential for HIV because her workplace deals with that a lot. The guy talked about being positive for HIV in 1984, and back then it was expected for them or for him to die. But there's been medicine since, hence him living almost a decade later. And this is interesting because next season has a house guest roommate with HIV, and we'll get there when we get there. Pretty much. Tammy and Beth are complaining about not being happy in their careers since Tammy doesn't want to be stuck at her center and not doing the stuff she went to school for. And it's honestly just a depressing job since you're dealing with these people who are, a lot of them are just dying. And Beth is never happy with any job she has, and she's also currently a casting agent. Tammy talks about getting her mouth tightened and getting lipo, with everyone looking at her crazy because she doesn't need it. And I think she has since admitted to having an eating disorder and having body dysmorphia, so yeah. But the episode ends with Tammy quitting her job. So we essentially have another nothing burger of an episode among us, and the middle of the season has been pretty boring, I have to say. John talks about how much he hates LA, and they take pictures of Dory, or I'm kidding about that, since this was an entire decade before Finding Nemo was ever a thing. Anyways, the fish that's the same species as Dory dies, and John gets a movie offer regarding him being a countryman, but he has to leave for Kentucky soon. I guess because they went to Dominic's home, they wanted to do the same with John, getting some family context and content with him, and with them filming the season for 6 months. Anyways, we do see Aaron at his class in UCLA, which Dominic entertains with him as well. And I think him being under-edited to various points of the season had to do with him being in school, so that part I do kind of understand. After singing some bit and going to the church in his hometown, he flies back to LA and ends up rejecting the movie offer. Or he was going to reject the movie offer, but the movie producer took a while to call him back, so they essentially moved on. This episode has Glenn playing with his band, and the band is always at the house, which causes mixed opinions with people on the cast. They wake up with the bandmates eating their food, making their food, and acting like the house is theirs. But a lot of the roommates are trying not to say anything to Glenn because they really just don't want to cause drama. Glenn is tired of the cast not knowing one another, and of course Tammy is the one who calls out that he is too busy with his band, who is using the house like it's theirs, and Glenn calls the house guests boring. There is a fight that happens that I really don't care to recap that much, but after this fight, the house does decide to create a game for them to get to know one another, after 5 months of being in the house together. Beth A talks about her sexuality and mentions that who you are attracted to is such a minute part of who someone is. Beth S talks about losing her father and never going to his grave all these years later. And honestly, this is way too relatable for me. Aaron and Tammy admit that they are both aggressive and everyone is getting along at this point, which is nice. Beth A speaks to John about wanting to do something, so they end up going to get gifts and switches to the home list that they made, and the house ends up pitching in. John and Tammy talk about how good of a person Beth A is, and Tammy feels like she definitely misjudged her. The house do end up going to the bar that John sung some songs months. Sorry, they go to the club or the bar that John went months earlier to do a contest, and he does ends up winning it here. Beth S has a few guys that she is interested in, but her ex from college is coming in, and she is looking forward to seeing what happens. She does end up ditching him to take headshots, but he ended up leaving, and she mentioned that he got a bunch of tattoos, and it's just very conservative, so it's different, and things are kind of done with them. Tammy is in a relationship with someone that we didn't see much of at all, or if at all, up until now, and apparently she's the only one in a certified relationship at this point. And if you didn't know already, or if you couldn't tell already, this is a huge relationship focused episode. Beth brought over one of her other guys from Cleveland, I believe, and she has sex with him in the closet, which isn't revealed yet. Tammy broke up with her boyfriend, and I'm sure all of this happened within the weeks and months, but they're just airing all of this in one episode, which is why it kind of comes off as discombobulated. And it shows how they didn't really have the reality TV format yet when it comes to their narratives. But anyways, Tammy doesn't think that she is ever going to get married, but we do know that she will get married twice. Aaron is talking about his high standards regarding dating and how he is very, very picky. So pretty much Beth tells John about it, and then it gets around in the house. But she is denying it and claiming that it was just a kiss, though absolutely no one in the house believes her since she apparently told a few other people that they had sex. We then move on to Dominic, who is dealing with a woman he saw for a year. I don't know if it's referencing this last year or just a previous year, if that makes sense. Beth talks about her relationship. Sorry, Beth A talks about her relationship with women, and she's still single. And then we get a segment about how much Beth A and Glenn play around with one another, which confuses the house since she is a lesbian. In this episode, the cast does go to Mexico, so going on trips during reality TV seasons was already a staple here. And this early on in reality TV, it's pretty impressive. We do have a segment of how close Tammy and Beth S have gotten, and Beth, has a bad rep amongst the roommates, and then we have John and Tammy talking about how their relationship has improved since the beginning, where things were very rough between them. We move on to the men setting up for a bikini contest dressing like women, and they're just wearing dresses and stuff, so it's just weird. A drunk Dominic ends up passing out at the beach, and people are tired of him blaming his Irish heritage on him essentially being an alcoholic, at least according to the roommates, and they think that he has a serious drinking issue that he needs to handle. Anyways, we do see the cast then swimming in the coral reef water, riding horses, and then somehow Beth ends up injuring her arm riding a scooter. Glenn and Beth S end up doing their own thing in the evening from the cast, and then the others kind of show up at the club, but they, as well as Aaron and Dominic, are embarrassed by John doing the yeehaw, and it's clear it's kind of just John, Beth S. Sorry, I meant Beth A for Glenn and Beth A. Glenn and Beth A went to do their own thing, and essentially it's Beth S, John, and Tammy against everyone else. That's kind of the setup, where the other four were embarrassed by John doing the yeah, and it caused for a confrontation and an argument that happened with Tammy addressing it. And they kind of, or the three of them kind of find it hypocritical because Dominic can be drunk as a skunk and pass out in public, but John doing a in a club is embarrassing. And it's interesting how they pretty much air Glenn out in his confessional where he's talking about how he would never do something like that that's so embarrassing. And then they flash back to all the embarrassing stuff he did in public. Beth S is speaking to one of her men and she's arguing with him on the phone. And it's clear that man is just going through a whole lot. John is tired of them arguing on the phone every day, but Beth wants to help him, though it caused Beth's mother to not speak to her for a while. So this is a very heavy Beth S episode. Anyways, Beth's mother is flying down to the house where her mother starts cleaning up around the house because of how messy and dirty it is, to the point where she's telling them off about how dirty they are. Apparently, Her mother is the Polish radio voice in Cleveland, and the house is enjoying her, and Beth's heritage is Polish. Beth and her mother tell John that they don't spend time together at home, and the relationship is somewhat strained, since neither are known to express their feelings. And it's interesting that they told John about this, and Beth felt open enough to tell John about this. And I will say that I do like their friendship, and it's something that's very ongoing, at even as I speak. So they remained it 30 years later, or they retained it 30 years later. We then move on to Glenn really not liking Beth for being self absorbed, and the episode moves right to them arguing as he's the only one telling her how the house feels about her, or at least that's how he sees things, and she doesn't get why he's always coming at her like this. Ron is tired of the men constantly badgering on Beth, and he thinks that Beth S is being scapegoated. This somehow causes him to argue with Aaron, who likes to steamroll people in conversations, and it never ends well because Aaron doesn't listen. And I do agree with that. Aaron and Beth then end up arguing over their poor communication skills, but it does seem like they eventually clear the air that I don't know how genuine it really is on either side. We then see the Beths bonding over exercise, and finally has a conversation with Glenn where he doesn't take accountability for much, and she just wants to be respected. This episode ends with the class playing paintball with one another, which was nice. I really don't have much to say about the penultimate episode, but we do see the cast preparing for a showcase that Dominic is emceeing. I think he had connections to get them their invite. Anyways, Glenn's band, Tammy's group, and John are a part of it, and we do have Tammy and Glenn kind of tripping at one another because she does not want to hear his music since it ain't her genre, and pretty much she doesn't want to go first because she feels like she has to stay for everyone's performances afterwards, and honestly, it's just kind of rude on her part. Tammy is looking forward to it since no one has seen her group perform before, and she didn't feel like they were ready beforehand. Anyways, a very simplistic episode, and we're just gonna move right along. We are at the finale, which covers the last week in the house, and they have to do all of these promo shoots as well as interviews for the show. Just like last season, they aired the season literally right after the season filmed, hence them doing it like this, and there being no breather between filming and airing. Beth S. is annoyed that they called her a lesbian. Essentially, they got the wrong woman, and they are reading what the press is defining them as in their papers. Aaron is focusing on his final exams, and one of the reasons why he's so focused on education is because people assume that he was a dumb blonde. The Beths think that John has changed the most, and they are all kind of just talking in their interviews about where they think that others will be in 5 years. Everyone is talking about their individual future, their opinion on the others, and how they're going to deal with ending this experience. Their last day in the house is the day of Aaron's graduation, and in the evening they do have a real cake celebration. Anyways, they do their final confessionals, and it's a group of them, and they have to keep on mentioning doing something sincere or saying something sincere. So it just shows how they really just didn't get along, and then they all thought one another were fake. And pretty much Sarpa's Aaron ruins it, but they do have a better goodbye when they're at the front door, and that concludes the season. I didn't really like Aaron, and I found him to be a hypocrite throughout the season. He talks about how conservative he is and how he wouldn't do certain things only to do those exact things he was critiquing. I did like how focused he was on his education, but I found his holier than thou attitude to be annoying as hell. But he's very, very successful, and it definitely made sense why he wasn't on Homecoming, based on him being so career focused and him not wanting to do certain things on camera, even in this season. So it's definitely interesting watching Beth's origin story with her father's death and her distant relationship with her mother, and even her talking about her Polish heritage, which does explain some of her behavior that we've seen on The Challenge, and even just in the years post reality TV. It is funny how even back then, she was seen as a huge drama queen, though she's definitely a lot more subdued compared to how she will be on The Challenge, though you can tell that she loves entertainment, hence her future, and she just wanted to be famous. But because the formula wasn't really set yet, she didn't really know how to execute that. But she definitely had her moments here and there. She just wasn't over the top like she will be on The Challenge. Shockingly, I don't have a whole lot to say about Dominic. And I did think that they were expecting him to be a lot more crazy and dramatic than he ended up being in reality. Anyways, his and Aaron's friendship were cool despite them having different political beliefs, and you can tell how career focused those two were. And I heard that he's a big time executive now, which is one of the reasons why he wasn't on Homecoming, though he did consider it more than Aaron did. Overall, I was just fine enough with him. Alrighty, so John owned me for a lot of the season, and he was definitely in the position or the casting trope that Julie was last year and last season, with being the youngest and being very conservative. Even watching his origin story and seeing it translate to how he was on the challenge was interesting, though he was a lot more interesting here than he was on the challenge, where you could just tell he didn't give an F on the challenge. And I guess it explained why he wanted a record deal so badly on World Rules All Stars. It was cool to watch his friendship with Beth, knowing that it's still ongoing today as I speak, and now they host a podcast together. So at least that's sincere. So, watching Tammy decades before her run on Basketball Wives was interesting, as we saw her talk a bit about her Islam religion, deal with abortion, which was a huge deal at the time because that was never really something that's really discussed on TV before, much less shown, and more details about her family life. While her thirst for the entertainment industry was always there. In a lot of ways, she was the same, and in a lot of ways, she was different as well. And it's also interesting because Basketball Wives is also life based. Like the type of reality show, it's about you living your life. It's not competitive reality TV like the challenge is. So seeing her on both shows, where obviously in Basketball Wives, she's a divorcee, she's a mother of two, and she's much older, and she went through a lot more things. It was definitely interesting, though some of the unsavory elements of her personality were still present on Real World. I don't have a lot to say about Glenn, especially since he was invisible pretty much for half of his time in the house, and he spent most of his time with his bandmates and people not on the cast, though he did get more argumentative during his last few episodes, but he really was just there otherwise. Other Beth, or I should say Beth A, didn't have much to do, and while I appreciated her talking about her sexuality, she really didn't get much screen time otherwise. But overall, I didn't really mind her, despite not being the most memorable person. Well, that concludes my review slash recap of the second season of The Real World. It was definitely clear that a lot of this cast didn't like one another, and that apparently did not change 30 years later when they were on Homecoming. And you can tell that a lot of the cast were kind of just doing their own things for a lot of the season. And I know from the two latter seasons that I did watch, they tighten things up where the cast has to interact a lot more with one another, and they can't just be gallivanting doing their own thing. I honestly think this season, while a good season, it did suffer from being way too long. And from what I looked up regarding the next season, it's just as long too. So 5 to 6 month seasons might just be the norm for the next 5 to 10 seasons, which I'm definitely not looking forward to. It will be interesting because there's only one more season that has homecoming context in it, where I could at least do updates or see how things traveled over throughout the decades. So that's essentially going to be it. It's interesting seeing some huge reality TV icons like Tammy Roman and even Beth in her own way, making names for themselves here and seeing how little things changed, or they did change. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more soon.